This morning, an official scheduling amendment from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs landed on desks in Brussels and Washington, confirming a structural disruption to Western diplomacy. The G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains, originally locked into the international calendar to begin on June 14, was officially delayed by 24 hours to June 15. That single-day postponement took place because the President of the United States chose to host a commercial mixed martial arts event on the South Lawn of the White House to celebrate his 80th birthday, while heavy construction crews spent the first 2 weeks of June erecting a wire mesh combat octagon on the executive grounds. A parallel and entirely contradictory diplomatic operations was unfolding across European capitals. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney departed Ottawa on June 11th for a high-intensity, 6-day European tour that explicitly bypassed Washington. This was Carney's 9th official visit to Europe since taking office 15 months ago, a frequency that establishes a major pivot in Canadian foreign policy. The simultaneous execution of these two agendas, one defined by domestic spectacle and the other by quiet institutional integration, reveals that the traditional center of gravity within the Western alliance is actively shifting. That sequence of events is not coincidental. It is a direct policy statement. When Carney sat down with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Palais de l'Élysée on June 12, the outcome was not a standard bilateral photo opportunity, but a signed General Security of Information Agreement. This specific legal instrument expands highly classified intelligence sharing across 4 critical sectors: defense, space, artificial intelligence, and aerospace procurement. What that framework does, structurally, is redirect the trajectory of Canadian industrial integration away from the United States and directly into the French defense establishment. It allows Canadian firms to bypass standard non-EU restriction protocols, establishing a durable security bridge before the G7 leaders even arrived at the summit table. From Paris, Carney traveled immediately to Dublin, mixing a symbolic visit to his ancestral home in County Mayo with a highly strategic address at Trinity College on June 13. Standing in one of Europe's oldest academic institutions, Carney delivered a speech that targeted the core premise of American diplomatic dominance, stating that middle powers must combine to create a third path with impact rather than competing for the favor of great powers. He went on to declare that the new world order will be built starting with Europe, describing Canada as the most European of non-European nations. What that rhetoric reveals is a deliberate choice by a major G7 partner to publicly de-emphasize Washington as the default anchor of Western democratic cooperation on the literal eve of a critical summit. This structural alignment becomes legible when evaluating the hard data Carney used to back up his position. In February 2026, Canada quietly became the first non-European state to secure formal entry into the European Union's Joint Defense Procurement Initiative, known as the Security Action for Europe Mechanism, or SAFE. This membership grants Canadian defense contractors direct access to European state procurement programs that were previously closed to external allies. Furthermore, Carney disclosed that Canada has finalized 56 critical mineral partnerships across 10 nations, with the absolute majority located in Europe. Because lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements form the physical foundation for advanced semiconductor fabrication, artificial intelligence data hubs, and defense supply chains, these agreements effectively lock Canada's vast natural reserves into European industrial pipelines, out of reach from unilateral American tariff maneuvers. The macroeconomic mathematics underpinning this strategy are substantial. Together, Canada and the European Union possess a combined consumer population exceeding 740 million people, which is more than double that of the United States. Their combined economic output is roughly equivalent to the American market, while their integrated defense expenditure stands at twice the annual military budget of China. This data indicates that the European pivot is not a temporary diplomatic maneuver, but a calculated effort to aggregate middle power capacity into a bloc capable of negotiating with Washington or Beijing from a position of structural parity. The lineage of this policy dates back to Carney's January 2026 address, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he declared the traditional rules-based order defunct, a position he reinforced in May 2026 at the European Political Community Summit in Armenia. This diversification strategy is accelerating due to a looming economic deadline closer to home. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which dictates the terms of North American trade, faces a mandatory joint review on July 1, exactly 16 days from today. Senior American trade officials have publicly labeled the existing treaty a poorly structured arrangement that requires comprehensive revision, raising the distinct possibility of sudden tariff implementations. While 85% of Canadian exports to the United States currently move tariff-free, the structural vulnerability is acute, given that 3/4 of Canada's total export volume remains bound to the American market. By driving 71% surge in bilateral trade with the European Union through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, a shift that added €3.2 billion to the EU market and $1.3 billion Canadian dollars to Canada's economy in 2025 alone. Ottawa is attempting to insulate its domestic industries from a potential cross-border trade dispute. When the G7 leaders finally convened in Evian-les-Bains on June 15th, the deep internal divisions within the alliance immediately collided with the official agenda. The American president arrived fresh from his South Lawn event, where approximately 5,000 attendees witnessed 7 full-contact bouts inside a temporary arena, and immediately announced a preliminary agreement to halt the 15-week military conflict with Iran. Although this sudden announcement caused global oil futures to drop by 4%, and promised the reopening of the strategic Strait of Hormuz for mine clearance, it did little to erase the unilateral friction of the preceding months. The initial military operations against Iran launched on February 28 without any prior consultation with European NATO allies, drawing public condemnation from Macron, who categorized the campaign as operating outside the boundaries of international law. The conflict drove global energy costs past $115 per barrel, resulted in over 2,400 Iranian casualties, according to human rights monitoring data, and cost the United States Department of Defense $11.3 billion in its opening 6 days alone, all while upending European energy security through force majeure declarations on Qatari liquefied natural gas contracts. This unilateral approach to international security has fractured the core mechanism of the G7 itself. For the second consecutive year, following the gridlocked 2025 meeting in Canada, the summit is highly unlikely to produce a unified joint communiqué. Instead, diplomats are drafting isolated, area-specific outcome documents focusing strictly on supply chain logistics and critical mineral distribution, a format that allows individual states to sign independent agreements without forcing a group consensus that no longer exists. The total absence of a final communiqué is a major diplomatic indicator, signaling to non-aligned nations that the G7 can no longer function as a cohesive geopolitical unit. While the American administration demonstrated that it can still alter global markets through sudden, high-stakes announcements, the Canadian delegation spent the preceding week quietly laying down institutional tracks that assume a post-American alliance structure. But the more consequential question, the one that global market analysts and defense planners are tracking with intense strategic scrutiny, was still unanswered. The administrative postponement of the G7 summit to accommodate an American commercial spectacle exposes a fundamental friction point within the Western alliance, while Washington prioritizes highly visible, unilateral actions. Its traditional partners are quietly laying down institutional tracks that assume a less centralized international framework. The initial days of the meeting in Evian-les-Bains demonstrated that the United States can still single-handedly move global energy markets with a sudden diplomatic announcement. But that market movement occurred against a backdrop of deliberate structural decoupling by other member states. To understand how deep this fragmentation runs, one must examine the specific institutional mechanisms being built away from the main summit table. On June 16th, while the official G7 working sessions on regional stability were still underway, the Italian government confirmed a major raw material arrangement that bypassed traditional multilateral channels. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni publicly thanked the Canadian Prime Minister for securing an agreement that grants Rome priority access to Canada's critical mineral stockpiles. What that transaction accomplishes in practical terms is the selective insulation of European supply chains from external geopolitical disruptions by locking down preferential distribution rights for raw materials essential to high-tech manufacturing. European economies are creating dedicated industrial reserves that do not rely on the legislative stability or trade goodwill of the United States. Governo.it. This approach is mirrored in how individual member states are handling defense financing outside of standard Washington-led institutions. During a bilateral meeting on the margins of the summit, details emerged regarding Canada's establishment of a dedicated defense, security, and resilience bank. This new, state-backed financial institution is specifically structured to provide long-term, low-cost financing for international security initiatives, clean technology, and heavy infrastructure reconstruction projects. What this financial vehicle creates is an autonomous funding pipeline that dilutes the gatekeeping authority of traditional international financial bodies where Washington wields a veto. It allows middle powers to fund strategic projects directly, establishing a parallel economic architecture that can survive sudden shifts in American congressional spending priorities. The intentionality behind this multi-layered diplomacy becomes clear when looking at the expanding web of security arrangements stretching into the Indo-Pacific. Immediately following the raw material talks with European leaders, an official communiqué confirmed that Canada and India have launched formal negotiations on their own comprehensive General Security of Information Agreement. This development follows a rapid progression in bilateral trade discussions aimed at finalizing a full comprehensive economic partnership agreement before the end of the year. That rapid escalation in security and economic ties demonstrates that the strategy of institutional diversification is not confined to the North Atlantic. It is an active effort to connect middle power economies in Asia and Europe into a singular, resilient network that does not require an American security guarantee to enforce its trade corridors. www.em.she.ca. The rhetoric deployed by these leaders during the summit reinforces the reality that these structural moves are part of a deliberate long-term framework rather than temporary posturing. When addressing the press in Evian-les-Bains regarding the ongoing pressure on Eastern European security structures, the Canadian Prime Minister stated that the tide is turning and emphasized that middle powers are executing an energy and defense package designed to achieve a just and lasting peace. What that phrasing reveals is a calculated emphasis on collective institutional action over unilateral executive deals. By explicitly framing international security as a product of integrated defense industrial partnerships, rather than personal diplomacy between superpowers, these governments are attempting to codify a system where institutional agreements outlast individual political administrations. The durability of this alternative architecture is being tested directly by the shifting parameters of traditional Western security assistance. While the primary headlines from the summit focused on a major new package targeting 162 vessels and entities tied to foreign military supply chains, the actual mechanics of the aid package reflect a deeper industrial transition. The newer supply agreements focus heavily on localized joint manufacturing ventures, such as co-producing advanced drone systems and air defense components directly within regional manufacturing hubs, backed by billions in non-American financial commitments. This shifting allocation of capital structurally alters the long-term dependency curves of global defense procurement. It signals that European and middle-power defense contractors are successfully decoupling their industrial bases from American supply chains, ensuring that their manufacturing lines can continue to operate even if a future Washington administration decides to implement sweeping export controls or restrict technology transfers. This step of institutional diversification is fast, approaching its most critical checkpoint, which is located far from the resort docks of Evian-les-Bains. In exactly 16 days, on July 1, the formal review mechanism for the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement will legally commence, forcing a hard choice on an American administration that has frequently questioned the utility of legacy trade pacts. If Washington chooses to demand sweeping concessions or threatens a total dissolution of the North American trade framework, it will instantly validate the urgent diversification strategy executed by its partners over the preceding 15 months. The unresolved tension that hangs over the final sessions of this G7 summit is not whether the temporary peace agreement in the Middle East will stabilize global energy markets for the current quarter. The true question, the one that sovereign wealth funds and industrial planners are watching with absolute focus, is whether the parallel economic and defense architecture built by these middle powers has achieved enough mass to withstand a structural break in North American trade. The multi-layered institutional maneuvers executed outside the central chambers of the Evian-Lesbian summit present a complex map of modern diplomacy, yet they point toward an undeniable tactical conclusion. While international attention remains focused on high-stakes, headline-grabbing announcements from Washington, a quiet and systemic realignment of power is actively underway. The traditional model of Western cooperation, which for decades relied on a single superpower to anchor its economic and security architecture, is being replaced by a highly deliberate network of decentralized partnerships. By shifting the focus away from a single, unpredictable center of gravity, these middle powers are not looking to provoke a direct confrontation. Instead, they are quietly rendering the old framework obsolete for Canada. This strategic shift means an aggressive transition away from structural dependency on the North American market. By establishing 56 critical mineral partnerships and securing unprecedented access to European Union defense procurement through the SAFE mechanism, Ottawa is insulating its core industries from the impending turbulence of the July 1 trade review. This structural pivot allows Canadian exporters to leverage their raw material dominance into a durable, multi-continental trade network, ensuring that the country's economic security no longer hinges on a single legislative decision in Washington. The likely next move for Canadian planners will be the rapid finalization of parallel security and data-sharing agreements in Asia, extending this architecture into the Indo-Pacific to cement a truly global alternative supply chain. For Europe, the decline of a centralized Washington-centric alliance structure serves as an explicit catalyst for industrial and military consolidation. The Security of Information Agreement, signed at the Palais de l'Élysée, and the integration of advanced joint defense manufacturing ventures signal that European capitals are preparing to manage continental security independent of external guarantees. By locking down direct resource pipelines with resource-rich middle powers like Canada, European industries are securing the physical inputs required to fuel their digital and defense transitions. The next logical phase for European leadership will involve standardizing these bilateral arrangements into a unified continental procurement framework, creating a cohesive economic bloc that can interface directly with global partners on its own terms. For emerging global players like India, this transition creates a major opportunity to reshape the terms of international engagement. The commencement of formal negotiations on a comprehensive security of information agreement with Canada demonstrates that New Delhi is actively using this period of Western fragmentation to strengthen its own industrial and strategic ties. Rather than aligning with a singular superpower bloc, India is positioning itself as a critical node in a multipolar network of middle powers, capturing high-tech investments and securing supply chain access without forfeiting its strategic autonomy. The likely next move for New Delhi will be the aggressive acceleration of bilateral trade pacts across both Europe and North America, using its massive market scale to negotiate from a position of enhanced leverage. Ministry of External Affairs. Ultimately, the events surrounding the Evian-Lesbian summit reveal that the true baseline of global power is no longer defined by the ability to dictate a unified international agenda. The single most important takeaway from this period in diplomatic history is that while a superpower can stall a summit to accommodate a domestic spectacle, It can no longer prevent its allies from quietly rebuilding the global order in the interim. The true architecture of future international relations is not being negotiated at the center of the table through sweeping multilateral communiques. It is being assembled piece by piece on the periphery through binding, bilateral agreements that operate independently of Washington's participation. The Western alliance has not experienced a sudden, dramatic collapse, but rather a calculated redistribution of its institutional gravity. The real question for the global economy is no longer whether the traditional rules-based order can be restored, but how effectively the new network can function when the old framework finally clears the stage.